tell us about Victory Day and why it's significant for Russians.
So this is probably after Orthodox Easter. This is Russians' biggest national holiday. It's the time when everybody comes out and feels like they have something to celebrate. And for a long time, I think Russians did have something to celebrate, and that was this enormous sacrifice that they made during World War II when something in the region of 25 million Soviets died. So obviously a great tragedy as well. And so this is Remembrance Day hyped up to 11 for them. It's a time when everybody tries to remember their ancestors. But unfortunately, in the last few years, it's really been taken by the government and twisted, corrupted, turned into something that's about authoritarian power and strength rather than about remembering ordinary people.
Does it point to why Russia's so keen to paint Ukraine as a Nazi influenced country? Because it points to their role in the Second World War, as they would see it with some justification, as being incredibly pivotal in defeating Nazism.
Well, of course, this is really at the core of the war today. When we think about the idea that Ukraine is a fascist country, which is, of course, completely absurd to us, to Russians, this is a story that they're told that signals that we have to do this again. We have to repeat the whole affair, and that really is the watchword for them. In the West, we think of the Second World War in the terms of never again. We would do anything to avoid it. But in Russian, they have the phrase, we can do it again, literally. And so when they hear that Russia is threatened by fascists, by shadowy forces, by invaders from the West, there is this great motivating force acting on ordinary people that's going to get them G'd up and excited about war, with some trepidation and fear, of course, mixed in too.
And how will that play out in the propaganda of the day, do you feel?
So I think on the day, this is going to be a time when the government will, of course, there will be the big parades on Red Square that we all know, the soldiers marching through Moscow, the tanks and the missiles rolled along, maybe in front of Putin, although I suspect he may not be there in person this year. But really what we're going to hear is, or what Russians will hear, is a story that all the sacrifices that are being made in the present, those sanctions, the changes in everyday life, maybe the stories of bodies coming back from Ukraine, of soldiers dying on the battlefield, this is all worthwhile. It's all in the name of, for them at least, what is considered a good cause. So this could be a big moment for the government's propaganda efforts to sell this, what is turning out to be a really difficult war, to its population.
And may they be selling the narrative that this is a war that could be a long one to fight? This is a long haul war, because a lot of the conversation about Putin's weaknesses, as the bodies start to pile up, he'll struggle to make the case for the ongoing war. Is it quite important, perhaps, for him on this day to say, Second World War went for a long time, we're in it for the long haul?
Yeah, you're right. And I really think that this idea that the bodies piling up necessarily being a bad thing for Putin is something of a red herring. On the surface, it makes sense. I understand that. And of course, there's a limit at which point Russians may not tolerate things anymore. But hearing about sacrifice only reminds Russians of these great sacrifices they made in the past in World War II, when the numbers were so enormous that you almost can't wrap your head around the idea of millions and millions and millions of people dying, entire generations of young men being wiped out at the front. So learning about sacrifice only encourages Russians to want to participate in this long war, not to quit, not to give in. It seems very backward to us, but it all makes sense when you're stuck in this little bubble of propaganda the government has created, where these messages are being pumped at you 100 miles an hour over every channel, over social media and in newspapers, nonstop. It's constant, and it's been constant for a decade.
And that's an interesting thing about propaganda, I think, is that if you're outside of it, it can seem crass, it can seem glib and almost naive, because it's easy to think, well, most sophisticated Russians will see through it. But if you're living it, the point of propaganda is ultimately it becomes like water for a fish. You can't really see it because it's part of your everyday environment.
Uh, Water for a fish, exactly. That's really the way to understand this. Of course, there are a great many Russians who aren't convinced by this. Don't get me wrong. There is hope for getting out of this war, and there is hope for a Russia beyond this addiction to aggressive and macho nationalism. But for many others, when your friends are telling you that these things are true, when you're hearing these stories, at some point, even if you're a rational person, even if you're very highly educated, you're going to start to think there's just no smoke without fire. There's got to be something to this.
Do you think that the 9th of May has played a part in the war strategy that in order to give himself something for the 9th of May, that's why Mariupol has been bombarded? Is there a connection between what Putin wants to see, what he's willing to endure in Ukraine ahead of the 9th of May? Is it as significant as that?
This is a story that's been bandied about on social media and in some Western mainstream media, and I really don't buy it at all. I'm not getting any of that sense from my monitoring of Russian social media sources, of ordinary Russians, and from Russian mainstream media. The thing about the propaganda is that any way you cut it, 9th of May can be turned into a victory. Either things are going well for the Russian army, in which case they will be well publicized, or things are going badly, in which case this narrative of martyrdom and sacrifice can just be amped up more than it might necessarily need to have been done otherwise.
So actually, the notion I think I've taken from this conversation, which is really fascinating, is that actually the notion of endurance is the lesson from the Second World War, and that doesn't require victory. That actually does require martyrdom, and martyrdom requires loss. So losses don't necessarily harm that propaganda effort in that sense.
Exactly, and it makes just the way this war is going to play out in terms of morale, psychology, and propaganda really complex. It's hard to see how it's going to unfold, but don't assume that loss and damage and financial hardship is necessarily going to be interpreted as a bad thing.